One of the most remarkable pieces of cloth in history. Of course, I'm talking about the Shroud of Turin, and with us is an expert, somebody who's probably looked at it more ways than any of us ever will. He is the founder of the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project, and the editor and founder of the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website online at shroud.com. It's our honor to welcome Barry Schwartz to the
My
Prophecy
pleasure.
Center.
Derek, thanks for having
Pleased to
me.
meet you. So how did you get involved with the Shroud of Turin? You basically have been a professional photographer all your life.
Correct.
How did you get looped into looking at this piece of cloth?
Well, I had operated a photographic studio that specialized in scientific, medical, technical, and commercial photography. Not portraits and weddings, but working a lot in the corporate scientific area, a lot of aerospace clients. And so I had a good, strong technical background as a graduate of Brooks Institute of Photography, and then being on the faculty there years later. So I was approached by a gentleman who worked with a company that was a contractor to Los Alamos National Laboratories. And they were looking for somebody who was a photographic consultant to work with them. They needed to get images off of green screen raster display monitors, which, now all we have to do is hit the print screen button and we're done. In those days, you had to set up a camera, block all the light, cut the reflections, and know the right exposure to capture what was on these green screen displays, much like an oscilloscope display. So we did a 7-month project for Los Alamos. Obviously, it had to do with atomic bombs. And I'd tell you more, but then I'd have to kill you, so we'll leave it at that. And we did this project for 7 months, and when we finished the project, I went back to my normal routine, and the gentleman who I'd worked with, an imaging scientist, called me up a few weeks later, and he said, "Barry, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" So I laughed, and I said, "But Don, I'm Jewish." And he laughed, and he said, "So am I, remember?" He was one of the other Jewish guys that wound up on our team. And so he explained to me that they had learned some new information about the Shroud. They'd run it through a device called a VP8 image analyzer, which was able to visualize the spatial information that's encoded into the Shroud's image, depth or topographical information encoded directly into the density of the image. And you can't do that with normal photography, and you certainly can't do that in an artwork. So that facet of the Shroud's image, that physical property of the Shroud's image, caught my interest. But I was very apprehensive about getting involved with something that I felt had really little to do with me. And so I said no at first. And he said, "Let me bring you some information, and you can look at it and consider it." And what he brought me was a pile about this high of religious tracts. That didn't help a bit. So there I was, sort of caught in between, fascinated by the image, and I thought, well, maybe I'll go ahead and get on this team. A few months goes by, and I'm really feeling uncomfortable about it. I didn't really have a comfort zone with it. I felt, I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. So for me, this was about something that really had little, I felt at that time, to do with me. A few months into the project, a couple of new guys joined the team, imaging guys, from the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California, from NASA. And one of the two gentlemen, Don Lynn, may he rest in peace, was the head of imaging on Voyager, Viking, Mariner, Galileo. You might have heard of some of those. And Don Lynn was a good Catholic man, and I remember saying to him one day, "Gee, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing on this team?" And he looked at me and said, "Well, apparently you've forgotten that the man in question's a Jew." And I said, "No, that's about the only thing I knew about Jesus, that he was Jewish." But I said, "No, that wasn't what my problem was." And he said, "So you don't think God wants one of his chosen people on our team?" And then I laughed. I said, "No, I never thought that." And then Don gave me what perhaps, in retrospect, may have been the best advice I've ever been given. He said, "Barry, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know." And on those words, I stayed on that team. And the beauty of it is, of course, that's 35 years ago. The course of my life was dramatically altered by my involvement with the Shroud. Although, much to the chagrin of many of the people attending this conference, when I say I'm a Jew, I'm not a Messianic Jew, which is a real shock to people. But I have to be honest. My involvement with this came from science, from my technological experience and background. And yet, after examining the Shroud, it took another 17 years until 1995 for the evidence, the scientific evidence, which I helped to gather, collect, and reduce and evaluate, for that evidence to ultimately leave me with no alternative but to accept the Shroud as authentic. And I often quote Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes. If you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth. And by applying that axiom and studying it for a long time, almost 20 years, in 1995, the last piece of evidence came in, and I had no alternative but to accept the Shroud was authentic. There's no other possible explanation. The image on this cloth formed by some interaction between the cloth and the body that it covered. And our science, which is published in serious, high-end, peer-reviewed journals, not these internet open access journals that you pay the money and they publish, journals where if there's anything not 100% about your work, rejected. And so our work is all published in credible, serious journals. Remember, this is from 30 years ago, before the internet, before these open access journals, which are sort of money pits. You know, you throw the money. The only thing they review is the check. If the check clears, your paper's published.
Yeah.
And we didn't have that kind of capability. We had to really be absolutely disciplined and getting our material into the high-end journals that we wanted to. And so the evidence that eliminates, for example, the Shroud being not just an artwork, but consequently a graven image, which is a great concern to evangelicals, by the way. And it's an argument I hear a lot from evangelicals. Is, well, wait a minute, you know, this is a graven image. Well, look, I remind them, Jews know about graven images.
Right.
We had a golden calf.
Yeah,
Cost us 40 years in the desert, okay? So if this were a graven image, first of all, I wouldn't do this if I weren't absolutely convinced in the core of my heart that this is the real thing. And, you know, I'm going to tell you what my 90-year-old Jewish mother, born in Poland, immigrant to America at age 7, she heard me give a lecture some years ago, and we were driving back to her place, and she was very quiet. Now, you know, when a mother's quiet, that makes you a little nervous, but when a Jewish mother's quiet, be afraid. So I was curious, and I said to her, well, because she heard my lecture for the first time in person. I said, well, what do you think? And she looked at me, and she said, well, of course, it's authentic. And I'm shocked. This little lady, not well-educated, you know, immigrant from Poland, said it was authentic, and I was curious. I said, well, what makes you say that? And she said, Barry, typical Jewish mother condescending attitude, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it didn't belong to Jesus. If it belonged to anybody else, nobody would care. And I laughed. I thought, what a clever answer. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized what a profound observation that is. This is a burial shroud. No doubt that it's an authentic burial shroud. What happens to burial shrouds? They go in a tomb with the body decays, the cloth decays, the end. Here we have an intact burial shroud with a complete image of a crucified man, as a matter of fact, so perfectly matching the gospel accounts of what was done to Jesus that I was having a radio interview with a skeptic at one point, and he said, well, I can't accept the shroud's authentic. He said, because it's just too perfect. And I said, oh, so if it were less perfect, then you would accept its authenticity? He said, of course not. So in other words, once people have made up their minds, there's no convincing them. And look, it's not my place to try and convince people. I'm here just to tell the truth. I mean, I have nothing to gain by doing this. If anything, it's been a giant cut and pay, you know, from the work I did when I was in Los Angeles producing video. But operating the nonprofit, concentrating on educating people to the Shroud of Turin, giving them access to the real data, minimizing the spin, reviewing the materials that go on our website before we put them there to ensure that they're credible. All of that is part of my mission now, which is simply to tell the truth. Think of this. There were at least 1 billion people on this planet who had more right to be in that room than I did. And yet God saw fit to put me in that room. For what? For who? Certainly not for me. But for me to be there, to be a witness to the event, so that I can share it with you and with all those to whom this is important. So that's an awesome responsibility. I often say, and I'll say that later today in my lecture, at the end, isn't it funny how God always picks a Jew to be the messenger? And I feel myself to be a messenger of the truth, not to convince people, not to preach to them, not to tell them how to believe or what to believe, but just to say, look, this is like a document of what was done to Jesus, a forensically accurate document of the Passion. If that isn't something of value to all Christians, then I'm shocked, because it even forced me to confront my own faith, and it brought me back to my belief in God, my faith in God, at age 50. I had walked away when I was a kid, never looked back. God was not a part of my life until I was in my 50s. And it was, how many Jews can say the Shroud of Turin's what brought them back to their faith in God?
I would say you could probably count them on one or two
One
hands,
finger.
maybe, yeah, or possibly one
Yeah,
finger,
yeah.
yes. You say that it was a number of years after you began the project or got involved with the project that the final piece of evidence fell into place.
It's true.
What were the steps along the way? What was the initial piece that intrigued you? What was the final piece that convinced you?
Excellent. Excellent question. Well, at the beginning, of course, I expected, and I said this publicly, much to my chagrin, I expected to walk in and take a close look and see the paint and the brushstrokes and go home. That was how nonchalant and kind of casual I was about this at the beginning. Took about 10 or 15 minutes after the shroud was put before us, and I knew immediately, couldn't be a painting. Now, people, you hear that in documentaries, and skeptics always say that. You know, any one of us should be able to identify a painting if we see one, especially if you can get this close to it. So it was real obvious right from the beginning it wasn't a painting, so I had to eat my own words right away. And yet, the properties of the image are such that after all the research our team did, after all the science that was done, published in the 3 years we spent reducing the data we collected, in the end, that science was pretty convincing that this was most likely authentic, but I had a problem. The problem is that the blood on the Shroud of Turin is still reddish in color. And old blood is supposed to turn black or brown, and it does so sometimes within an hour.
Right, right.
So that was a deal breaker for me, and no one had explained to me why the blood was red until 1995, and it turned out it was Dr. Alan Adler from our team, world-renowned blood chemist, also Jewish, for that matter, and he and I were on the phone, and I mentioned that I was having this problem with the red blood and that nobody had properly explained it to me. And so he said, Barry, first of all, he says, they tortured this man for over 24 hours. Started the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane, beating him up, gave him no water. By the next morning, they started scourging him. He went into shock, several kinds of shock, traumatic, anaphylactic. In the end, when somebody's tortured over an extended period of time, the liver starts pumping a lot of extra bilirubin into the bloodstream. And Al, being a blood chemist who had done the analysis on the shroud that proved that's human blood, found very high contents of bilirubin. Well, bilirubin is kind of an orangish colored substance, and so he said that kind of blood will stay reddish forever. Now, it turns out that was the last piece of evidence that pushed me over the threshold. But since then, new data has come out based on the way the cloth was manufactured and washed in this substance called soapstone or soapweed, saponaria. It was acted like more like a fabric softener to treat the cloth, because linen, freshly woven linen, is kind of stiff. And so this softens it up a little bit. And then they air dry it, and by evaporation out in the sun, left a tiny residue on the very top surface of those fibrils. And that residue is of this soapwort or saponaria, and it's a hemolytic agent, which means it breaks down red blood cells. So combine that with the bilirubin and the treatment of the cloth, and the blood will stay red forever. And we did some experiments with saponaria and non-treated saponaria cloths, ancient linens, and 34 years ago, that test was done, and the blood on that cloth is still red on the saponaria-treated half, and the non-treated half turned black or brown almost within an hour or two. So that was the final piece of the puzzle for me. And at that point in time, I had no other excuses. I couldn't think of anything else that was not part of the database of evidence that we'd put together that ultimately said anything more than this has to be the real thing. Has to be.
Now, the Romans crucified many, many people.
Absolutely.
Even if we identify through some of the pollen analysis that's been done of the plants that grow within a certain radius of Jerusalem, so we can identify roughly.
A couple of those. I'm not that convinced that evidence is as scientifically viable as some of the other evidence that we have. That's, there's some evidence. You got to understand, pollens could have come onto that cloth at any point in its history.
We don't have this kind of chain of evidence that you
Exactly.
require in a modern court of law.
And exactly. So if I'm looking at something that's pure science, absolutely verifiable science, I can't feel that aspect of it is that. The point is, I understand.
The point of the question is, if we can identify it roughly to a certain period of history and a certain geographic location based on evidence involved in maybe the way the linen was woven or other factors, and the fact that we know that the Romans liked to use the crucifix as a means of eliminating problematic people.
And also putting people on notice. If you're going to be a thief in this city, this is what you're going to get.
Well, how do we take it a step further then and say that there is evidence in this cloth that suggests this may be the very shroud that wrapped the body of Jesus?
Well, for one thing, the scientific evidence that we found on the shroud is absolutely 100% consistent with what was detailed in all 4 gospel accounts of what was done to Jesus. And there were some variations within those accounts, as you know, but in general, the story is exactly the same for all 4 gospels. So and although only one was written by an eyewitness anyways, but we do have that consistency. So we can take that as sort of a starting point, say, okay, it has to meet all these criteria. Well, the shroud, like that skeptic pointed out, is so perfect it meets them all. But the real question is, well, how do we know this is Jesus? They crucified thousands. They speared thousands. They scourged thousands. But only one man in history that we're aware of, who proclaimed himself the King of the Jews, had this nasty thorn bush smashed onto his head okay, you're the King of the Jews. Well, here's your crown as a form of humiliation and torture, because that would have hurt and bled a lot. And if you look at the man of the shroud, he has bloodstains all over his head, not just in a little circlet the way artists have depicted it. And see, there's the other thing. If the shroud were an artwork, let's look for a quick second at what artworks depict of Jesus. Have you ever seen Jesus depicted nude in an artwork?
Not entirely, no.
No. And yet the man of the shroud is completely naked, just like Jesus was when he was crucified. Immediately sort of going off the rails of any artwork in known history that depicts that particular scene. It's always with a modesty cloth. It's never quite that bloody as what we have really on the shroud. It's always a pretty little circle. That's the way the Romans depicted their emperors, with a little circlet of laurel wreaths and stuff. And so that's the way of the artist, using artistic license, could sort of make the scene of a terrible event a beautiful artwork. Well, the shroud isn't beautiful. The shroud is brutally honest. And because of the bloodstains on the head, the question really is, how do we know this is Jesus? What makes me believe it's Jesus? Well, it meets all the criteria, including the crowning with a cap or crown of thorns, which as far as we know, only happened once with the man we know as Jesus of Nazareth. So that was, in my journey to come to terms with this and ultimately come to accept it, all these kind of questions had to be answered, every single one. That's why I can easily give you the answers, because I've had to ponder this and come to the terms with this material for myself before I ever spoke out publicly. It was from 1978. It wasn't until 1996 when I put Shroud.com online. It took all that time just to get me convinced this was authentic. And before that, I wasn't giving interviews and I wasn't, speaking out publicly because I didn't feel qualified. Now I do. And ironically, I built the website, and within probably a year of that, as the website started to take off, I'm not a visionary. I didn't know the internet was going to explode. If I were really a visionary, I could have bought Microsoft and
early on, sure,
or Apple at $1 a share, but I didn't.
Yeah.
So I really wasn't a visionary. But I did see the merits and the value of the internet. So a year or so into it, what happened was people started asking me a new question. They said, "Well, what do you believe?" Well, I'd walked away from Judaism at age 13. Had my bar mitzvah, and I was done. Institutions, I just never felt close to God. I always felt there was this big institution in the middle of it all. And I can say that about many denominations. I'm not picking on any particular one. I'm including my own faith there. So I realized, because my job here is to kind of be honest with people and tell them the honest answers And that means if I don't know an answer, I say I don't know. But what I did learn through that is that people were very curious about my own faith. And because I wanted to answer honestly, it forced me at that moment in time. I had to look in my own heart and say, okay, Barry, you're 50 years old. You've walked through all this time of your life, through this path of your life, without any consideration of God. Now you've got people wondering what you believe. You better figure out what you believe. So it forced me to confront my own faith. Mm-hmm. And being raised in an Orthodox home, sort of like Fiddler on the Roof, God was part of everything every day. And when I looked in my heart, God was there. He was just waiting for me to acknowledge him. So even though I thought I was away from God, God wasn't away from me. And it took the Shroud of Turin for me to come to terms and understand that. How many Jews can say the Shroud of Turin brought them back to their faith in God? I can. So,
forgive me if this question is too personal, but
no
I'm
such
just
thing.
really curious because I was perhaps a similar journey. Raised in church, mainline Christian Protestant denominations. Went through a long period of believing myself to be a Christian without really knowing what that meant, or really accepting it.
It was the way I say it. It was from the lips, not from the heart.
Yes, and it was the process of having to becoming a father and realizing one day I'd have to teach my daughter what she believed, and how do I do that, or what was right and wrong, and how could I do that if I didn't understand why I believed what I believed. Having been in such close contact with the evidence for the Shroud of Turin, and seeing the way the Shroud closely fits the accounts of the Gospels, which, to my mind, would attest to the truth claims of the Gospels.
Yeah.
And Jesus' claim that no one comes to the Father except through me.
Why am I still Jew?
You still call yourself a Jew, right? And that's the question.
Yeah, I know. No, actually it's a very common question, and because I take a public role in talking about the Shroud, there is no such thing as an off-limits question. If I got to a point where I would go, oh, that's too personal, then I should stop doing this, because I'm addressing people's faith, even though that's not really what I'm addressing. I'm addressing an object to which may be important to their faith.
And which people will then need to consider as they determine what they believe, just as...
So, from my point of view, and I kind of intimated this earlier, that, I see myself as one who was given a great privilege to have been in this room where so many other people probably had more right to be there than me, but I was the one God put there. And I took very seriously, like anything in my career, when it came to my work, I took it very seriously, which is why I was able to stay self-employed for almost 45 years and survive, because I was serious about what I did and delivered what I promised. So, but basically, it took a while, but I realized that I was in that room not for myself, and that my role doesn't really matter what my beliefs are. What matters is somebody can speak honestly to what we know about the Shroud. I certainly can't be accused of having a Christian bias, which is what skeptics are always looking for.
Sure.
Some of the most vocal skeptics on the Shroud don't want to debate with me anymore because I know the science really well, so they can't compete with me there. And they can't accuse me of having a Christian bias because I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Messianic Jew. Much to the disappointment of many of my Christian friends, I might add.
Yes, and we've seen some. In fact, I've received a couple of emails about that here. You're really going to talk to this guy? I say, well, yes, I am.
Yeah, I know. I got, but listen, ironically, I got flack from the pro-Shroud people. You're really going to go talk to that group and say, put that on one of the Shroud blogs? And I had to defend myself and say, look, I'm not a theologian. I'm not going in and preaching. I'm not going in to tell anybody what to believe. I'm going in and I'm talking about a piece of cloth that may or may not be significant to their faith, and that's up to them to decide that. And so it's perfectly okay for me to go to any conference of any denomination if people are interested in hearing what we know about the Shroud, and if that can somehow be helpful to them, to either accept or reject, it doesn't matter to me. Then that is what I should do. So as soon as I posted that, sort of defending myself to the pro-Shroud crowd, the same blogger found something on a really extreme right-wing evangelical blog, 17 pages attacking me for being a disciple of the devil, for being a Jew and not accepting Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned something in all these years, that if you get attacked by both sides of an argument, you must be doing something right.
Yes, yes.
And so I feel this, that yes, I understand how some people feel. And my hope is some of those people feel the way they do because either they don't understand certain facets of the Shroud, or they've misinterpreted certain facets of the Shroud, or maybe they're just uninformed. They just don't have the information. So my goal isn't to change anybody or to change anybody's mind, or to convince anybody. I had a man come up to me after one of my lectures in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he said, Mr. Schwartz, that was a great lecture, but you'll never convince me. And I looked him right in the face and I said, what makes you think I even care what you believe? I said, that's between you and God. Take it up with him. He laughed. He was very serious at the beginning, but my response made him smile. And that's because it's not my place to tell people what to believe. I can tell you about a piece of cloth. I can share with you the impact that it's had on my life and on my personal faith. But what you do with that information is entirely up to you, and I have no problem if somebody comes up and said, it's a fake and you'll never convince me, just like I told that guy, hey, I'm not trying to convince anybody. It's not a competition. I'm not keeping score. And each person has to decide for himself. Look, that piece of cloth didn't come with a book of instructions. And no one's faith should rely simply on a piece of cloth.
Yeah.
Okay? So no book of instructions, no piece of cloth. Where's the answer to faith? In the eye and the heart of those who look upon it. So the Shroud is there, like a signpost. Here I am. And what does it say in the Gospels? It's, who do you say that I am?
Yeah.
Now, for a Jew to know that, you can see that I've really taken the time to study this well enough that I can address the questions that come to me, particularly from Protestants and evangelicals who look at it a little differently than the Catholic groups that I lecture to. And so I believe that my role isn't to get into the middle of the theological debate, but to say, look, as a guy who's an uninterested third party, not a horse in the race at all, I can look at this and I can tell you that from the evidence, which I've held in my hand, this can only be one thing. This can only be the cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus. Does that prove he was the Messiah? Does that prove there was a resurrection? No. Resurrection isn't. We can't go into a laboratory and resurrect people to see what kind of images we can make. Science can't test that. That's a test of faith. And so the Shroud is there to make us think about it, but it doesn't provide the answers. It mainly provides more questions, I think. But the good news is that I think if somebody takes it seriously enough to really look at it with an open mind, to set aside whatever biases they may have, and look at it honestly and sincerely, which I had to do as a Jew, felt very uncomfortable, but I forced myself to learn about this so that I could say, okay, is this valid or should I just walk away from this? Well, it's 35 years later and I haven't walked away because the evidence not only convinced me, but God, in my kind of rediscovering God within my own heart, I came to understand that's why I was on that team, not to make the photographs. Yeah, sure, that was part of it. But the real reason for me being on that team was so that years later I could bring this information to anybody in the world who wants it free, no advertising, on the internet, shroud.com. That's been the primary goal of all my involvement in there, kind of culminates in bringing that together. And now it also becomes my legacy, that it'll be there forever.
Barry Schwartz was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. He is the founder and president of the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, as he said, online at shroud.com. Barry, an education and an honor to speak with you today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Derek.
From the Prophecy Summit at Pikes Peak, I'm Derek Gilbert.